Limitless Kawaki has just made the loudest, most aura-farmingly juicy entrance back into the story. Like, holy moly, just look at this panel for a second. I can feel the aura through the bloody screen at this point. Since when did Kawaki get this inspirational? Like, screw 2016 LeBron, from this day forward, I'm taking Kawaki if I ever go 3-1 down in the series. And I'm gonna have to put my hands up and apologize to my boy Kawaki, because are we so for real? I sold every last Kawaki stock I possibly could, and I was on the side of my young lord Boruto. But god damn, was I so wrong to do so. Limitless Kawaki is, as of right now, fodderizing Jura.
That's not ridiculous. That's not ridiculous to say that.
Okay, maybe fodderizing is a little bit too far. And don't get me wrong, it's definitely not going to say like that. But I'll get a little bit more into what I think is about to go down later in this video. But first, let's actually go over what happened in this chapter that led to this point, because there are so many more reveals that just gives us so much to think about as fans. So the chapter begins back at Mitsky's side of the mission, where he's still in sage mode fighting off the claw grimes. It looks like at this point he's finally finished the job now, and these were the same claw grimes that were supporting Ryu against the rest of them. He doesn't actually look too tired right now, and he has obviously killed them all, which does say quite a bit about his levels of power, because these claw grimes are not weak by any means. And we also have to appreciate that Mitsky was also fighting Ryu in sage mode, so he has been using this ability for quite some time now, which is definitely going to be overlooked, but Mitsky has definitely improved quite a lot since the time skip, which I guess we all knew at this point. It's just a shame that I don't really see a way for him to really exceed where he's at now, because what major power up do you realistically see Mitsky even getting at this point? And I must say, for the future of this character, it does really boil down to the idea of him finding his own path or finding his son, and gaining a sense of humanity which he seems to be slightly lacking in, rather than having what everyone else has done to them, which is that drive to grow a lot stronger. Like, don't get me wrong, it's definitely a goal of Mitsuki's to get stronger and also protect Konoha or his son, but I think in his case it's not a focal point of his character. Regardless, getting back to the chapter, Konohamaru sees Mitsky and runs over to him, and Mitsky explains exactly what went down on their side of the mission. He then picks up Sarada on his back, who is still unconscious mind you, so it's clear that using this power without proper training must be a last ditch option for her, because if it doesn't work then she is straight up a sitting duck at that point. But Mitsky informs Konohamaru that Arya has already headed towards where Shinki was, and that's where he and Sarada are going now. Konohamaru says that Yodo's sacrifice was a worthwhile one, where he assumes that she would be happy to lay down her own life in order to save Shinki and also eliminate one of the Shinju. He then explains to Mitsuki that he was literally on the brink of death against Matsuri until Boruto rushed in to save him, which to me implies that Konohamaru is someone who was completely adamant that Boruto was a traitor, probably one of the most certain people there was actually, is starting to even doubt himself, especially in these instances as Boruto's actions continue to not align with what he had previously associated with Kawaki. And the fact that this time he actually listened to Boruto's orders rather than try and oppose them like he did back in chapter 12 shows a serious change in his character and his feelings towards Boruto. Konohamaru then confirms that as soon as Boruto appeared, almost that same instant, Jura showed up with full intention of killing Boruto, which Konohamaru realized was far more important to Jura than retrieving the thorn souls of his comrades, showing Jura's resolve against love, which he views as a fatal flaw. But despite his heart telling him to go save his comrades, he's much more focused on his goals, and with Boruto being more of a threat to his goals than losing a couple of Shinju, Boruto becomes Jura's main priority. Mitsuki then says that they should go back up Boruto against Jura, but Konohamaru refuses and says that they can't, as their mission is strictly get those thorn souls and get out of there, and that Boruto is basically only there to distract Jura whilst they were getting the thorn souls, and Konohamaru would have almost 100% have died if Jura were to target him instead of Boruto. But Mitsuki is still hesitant at this idea and wants to still go help Boruto. Konohamaru then explains that they need to go back to the place where they first grouped up with Arya and the others. This obviously confuses Mitsuki, but Konohamaru says that these were just Boruto's orders and that he must have formulated some sort of plan for them, and regardless of what they think, they should probably just entrust Boruto's plan and follow it. We then come back to Jura and Boruto, where Boruto is still trying to catch his breath and recover as he realizes that the damage he sustained from the wood style jutsu at the end of chapter 22 is actually a lot worse than he realized. Not deadly, but definitely puts him in a rough situation. Jura then pulls out a signature move and fires another Biju bomb from his eye at Boruto, who manages to dodge using flying thunder gods. Jura realizes that Boruto is able to easily react every time he does his jutsu due to the obvious wind up time and the visual visual indicator of the chakra building up next to Jura's eye that means as soon as he uses it, Boruto can just teleport away. So he then decides that a more effective option would be to use it as a sniper from a longer range, where Boruto can't see him wind up and it doesn't give Boruto enough time to react, which we've seen is obviously effective as it has worked against Boruto twice now. Jura also says that using it to scatter mini Biju bombs around may also be equally as effective, since it means that Boruto can't simply teleport away from one attack the instant he sees it, as he needs to track all of the smaller shots to ensure that it's safe to actually teleport to where he needs to go. Jura then starts flying up in the air trying to put some distance between him and Boruto, obviously intending on using a longer range attack, but Boruto manages to react again, dodging away without even using Flying Thunder God this time, but then Jura follows up with a barrage of Biju bombs, to which Boruto decides to launch a kunai straight at Jura's head. Jura obviously dodges this, but it wasn't meant to hit Jura in the head. Boruto instead uses it to get behind Jura, and he goes for a sword attack to try and land a blow behind Jura. But Jura manages to react and kicks Boruto's sword out of his hand, and Boruto is left suspended in the air with nowhere to go. So Jura obviously tries to counter this by landing a blow of his own, but Boruto manages to quickly get a Flying Thunder God off before Jura pierces him with his finger and teleports back to his sword, where he manages to grab it quickly before Jura can fully react, and he literally chops Jura's foot clean off. And this moment genuinely caught me off guard. Like, don't get me wrong, I thought Boruto could defend himself for the time being against Jura until he eventually ramped it up to the point where Boruto was fully pushed into a corner, but Boruto is actually bringing the fight to Jura here, and I must say he is definitely winning so far in this battle because Jura really hasn't done anything towards Boruto. But because of how much Boruto is spamming an advanced jutsu like the Flying Thunder God and also jutsu like Rasengan or Uzuhiko, his chakra is really going to deplete fast and Jura still hasn't sustained major damage. Anyways, I just want to quickly go back for a second and appreciate the way Ikemoto has drawn Jura here. I love the way that we can see that Jura is fully committed to just adding Boruto to that list of the Donut Gang. But on a serious note, it makes it so clear that every single one of Jura's attacks has full killing intent. He's not wasting any time here, and if there is any opportunity to kill Boruto, he will not hesitate to do so. I just appreciate the way that this is being conveyed, and it does show us that Boruto is able to hold his own for a decent amount of time against a full power with full killing intent version of Jura, provided this is Jura's final form, but a bit more on that later. Jura commends Boruto on managing to actually do some decent damage to him, obviously showing this means nothing to him, and ultimately he still has complete confidence in his power far exceeding that of Boruto's. Boruto then swings again with a flurry of attacks with his sword this time, but it looks like Jura manages to block all of them, and he then turns on Boruto, where he seems to love the idea of poking Boruto full of holes with his middle finger, but Boruto manages to block all of these attacks with his sword. Just a quick note to make here is the use of Jura's fingers in a close combat fight. We saw in the last chapter that him having the middle finger wrapped in the claw marks makes it majorly more durable, as he was able to block an attack from Boruto swinging his sword on multiple occasions using only his middle finger. But we have also seen that Boruto is able to slice through Jura when the area isn't protected by a claw mark, which does actually make sense as we saw that nobody apart from Kawaki can really do anything to the claw marks as they seem relatively indestructible, which then makes sense as to why Jura is always using this part of his body both defensively and offensively. Regardless, Jura then grabs a hold of Boruto's arm that was holding the sword, and Boruto realizes that when it comes to raw power he doesn't really stand a chance against Jura, and he cannot free his grip either, which means that he can't use a hand signs for Flying Thunder God, which shows that Jura is clearly aware that Boruto needs both hands to activate this jutsu, which really shows how versatile Jura can be in a battle, constantly observing and adjusting how he fights depending on his opponent. Jura then holding Boruto starts building up a Biju bomb in his eye ready to fire it at point blank range at Boruto, but instead Boruto manages to do the hand signs for purple lightning where he passes it through himself and Jura, obviously electrifying Jura in the process, which is actually potent enough to force Jura to lose grip of Boruto, which then allows Boruto to teleport away. I remember when I first saw this panel as a sneak peek, I was under the assumption, due to the obvious lack of context, that maybe purple lightning was an effective counter against Jura, but I think it was simply the pure potency of this attack that means that it fully caught Jura off guard and it looked like it actually hurt Jura to some degree. However, Jura notes that Boruto has become pretty sluggish here and his movements are definitely beginning to slow down, showing that fatigue I was talking about earlier clearly catching up to Boruto, because realistically you can only use a jutsu like the Flying Thunder God so many times before you run out of chakra, which is why Boruto so desperately needs a new power up like the Karma where he can actually actually do a decent amount of damage through raw power rather than relying on pure agility and outmaneuvering the opponent, because that can only get you so far, as we are seeing. But I guess his method of fighting is effective enough at stalling Jura, which was his main goal obviously. Jura realizes that just throwing out these tailed beast balls isn't going to work against Boruto, and he just needs to use brute force and beat Boruto to death instead. We then jump back to Konohamaru and Mitsky, who have now reached a starting point where they are still confused as to what awaits them or why Boruto wants to get them to specifically that location. Again, jumping back to Boruto and Jura, Jura goes straight on the offensive here and lands a decent punch on Boruto, which sends him straight into the ground. Jura then without hesitation flies up and charges a huge biju bomb and launches it straight down at Boruto, who is still on the floor. It's crazy how Jura literally had to fly upwards to get away from Boruto because he himself couldn't sustain a blast that come along with his biju bomb. But as it goes, Boruto reacts and uses Flying Thunder God to avoid this attack. However, this time Jura anticipated this and knows exactly where Boruto is teleported to, and he then rushes over without giving Boruto any time to breathe. He goes for another direct blow on Boruto, but Boruto manages to react in time, unsheathing his sword as he attempts to block Jura's slash from his middle finger. But this time is different, and I assume since they are both swinging at the same time, the stress on the sword is far more than when Jura was simply trying to block Boruto's attacks. And this time the sword gets chipped on Jura's middle finger, which causes massive concern for Boruto, which is crazy because at this point it's almost as if he values his sword above his own life, which is just a testament to the dedication Boruto holds to his promise to Sasuke and the respect he continues to still hold for his sensei, just showing us the type of character Boruto truly is. Regardless, Jura realizes that Boruto has no way to block another direct blow, and he kicks Boruto straight into the ground, and this time Boruto has sustained too many direct hits, and this one has knocked him unconscious. We then see Ada, who is watching the situation unfold, saying that she can't watch this anymore and she won't just watch Boruto get killed. And we see Kashin Koji, whose head is just in his hands, completely in despair because he has seen what is currently unfolding so many times before, and he knows that there is absolutely no way that Boruto doesn't die here, which to him spells the end of the world as they know it. Ada continues to press Koji, asking him why isn't he saying anything, but Koji suddenly feels something and he says the update is coming. Obviously, Ada doesn't know what this means, but we then cut to a scene where Kashin Koji's eyes roll to the back of his head as he becomes surrounded by tapes of future timelines. He then zooms in on a specific moment where it looks like Jura is holding his eye for some reason as Boruto still lies there unconscious. Ada is still confused as to what's going on here, and she asks him, what do you mean by something is coming? However, going back slightly, one of the more hidden but definitely noticeable moments from these timelines is Inogen, or maybe even Arya. It's unclear what it actually is because I'm making this video based on some relatively grainy scans, but it definitely looks like one of those two is down in the area where Shinki was turned into a tree, based on those pillars surrounding him. So getting back to Boruto and Jura, Jura is looking down at an unconscious Boruto, saying he is much tougher than he expected for even surviving that blow on its own. And he also knows that even after losing consciousness, Boruto continues to hold his master's blade, which Jura doesn't go into any further detail about, but it's the fact that he's making a note of this clearly shows that the entire concept of love is still something which very much confuses him, as he doesn't understand how Boruto's literal subconscious mind refuses him to let go of his treasured item. Something which I'm sure Jura won't understand and will make him forever more curious to learn about love, as it's proven to fascinate him so far. Jura then says that in honor of Boruto's extraordinary spirit, he will at least make Boruto's death a quick one, and he starts to build up another huge biju bomb, ready to genuinely this time wipe Boruto off the face of the planet. But in the blink of an eye, a rod pierces through the back of Jura's skull and through Jura's eye in the most badass entrance in the series thus far. As Jura looks to the back of him and sees Kawaki literally stood on his back, rod in hand, as he realizes that Boruto was never his final opponent. Kawaki notes that this blow was not enough to kill Jura and that he truly is a monster. Ada sees this and is completely taken aback by Kawaki's arrival, and she asks Koji what on earth is going on right now. Koji says that a different update has just occurred and it's been 6 days since the last update, where Koji notes that Kawaki joining is something where he has never seen before in all of his previous visions, and that Boruto in the past few days must have told Kawaki something that means that the timeline differs from what he had seen previously. Firstly, I want to go over another part of the vision we see from Koji, where like I said earlier, it's kind of unclear as to what's going on here because I have to make a script on the raw scans, but it looks like Hidari is reaching his hands towards Sarada's face, who is then staring back at Hidari, Sharingan fully awakened, which implies what was obviously going to happen in the future, which was Sarada fighting Hidari. But the more interesting fact here is, will Hidari be trying to steal Sarada's Mangekyo, because he noted in their previous confrontation that he would like the Sharingan since it would allow him to use Hidori, an ability in which naturally he wants to use being a clone of Sasuke. But I honestly don't think there's too much to go off here, as there is no context behind these visions, as Kashin Koji only goes over the Kawaki situation. However, we do need to discuss this new revelation regarding how 10 directions actually works, as what just happened here completely changes our perspective on this ability. Previously, I was under the impression that Kashin Koji could activate this ability at will to see future timelines, but it seems here as though he randomly gets new visions at the moment he calls the update. These visions seemingly come at sporadic times, and at least it's implied that it isn't necessarily specific events which cause a new update to occur, but it could be a case of when their timeline begins to differ from what was previously shown. For whatever reason, Kashin Koji receives a new vision that tells him about their new situation. So this in of itself makes sense, but from what it looks like, Kashin Koji is only really seeing one vision, just a really long one. However, previously the way it was worded, it makes it seem like he gets tons and tons of visions all at the same time of different possibilities of what's to come in the future. Because if you remember, Kashin Koji said that there was different timelines where Boruto learned different abilities, and using those different timelines, Kashin Koji could pick different jutsu or solutions to problems Boruto was having with jutsu and teach Boruto how to learn them most effectively. But if Kashin Koji was only getting an update every now and again, then surely he isn't seeing tons of timelines and making decisions based on that probability. Because that's another point, Kashin Koji used to use tons of timelines to determine a probability of something occurring, which he could then skew in a way if they were to follow certain conditions. The probability of a positive outcome will not necessarily be guaranteed, but at least most likely. But yet again, if this ability works in a way where Kashin Koji sees just one future timeline at random intervals, I don't really see how we could use this ability in the way previously described, which makes me think that maybe the writers are trying to alter the jutsu to make it seemingly less overpowered, where since there has been a difference in the timelines Kashin Koji sees, where he literally has never seen a future where Kawaki arrives to bail out Boruto, it just makes the jutsu seem a little less broken. Because previously Kashin Koji had a plan for literally every situation, but if things begin to differ, then maybe their future becomes a little less concrete. I'm not here to say that this new revelation is a plot hole, I just think the idea of a system that periodically updates Kashin Koji about the future doesn't necessarily align with what we previously understood about how this ability worked. But I might be wrong here, and that's just my understanding of the situation, and if you disagree, feel free to let me know in the comments, because I want to know what you guys think about this change and how we understand 10 directions. Regardless, I also want to go over exactly why did Kashin Koji never see a vision of Kawaki showing up on the battlefield, and how Boruto managed to literally alter the future. Well, it all comes down to the idea of points of singularity. If you remember back to when Kashin Koji initially described the points of singularity, he said that they were people who become aware of the future and hence also alter the future with the knowledge of the future, if that makes sense. Since it's human nature to act differently when you know that something will occur, and since you are now acting differently as to how you would have previously before you obtain that knowledge, the future will begin to alter, which is obviously why there is constantly changes in the future timelines Kashin Koji sees, because when he sees a change in a timeline, he also makes changes to try and get the best probability or chances of beating Code and the Shinju. But obviously, since the singularities of fates remain to just be Ada, Boruto and Kashin Koji, nothing had really altered significantly with their future, because them just knowing about the future didn't really cause much of a significant change, because previously Boruto was not acting on his own with this knowledge, and he was just relying on what Kashin Koji told him to do. However, this time Boruto went against Kashin Koji's word and has gone out of his way to go and tell Kawaki here a plan where Boruto and Kawaki fight Jura together. So it makes sense as to why this bypassed Kashin Koji's 10 directions, but there was also so many visions Kashin Koji saw where Boruto went here and died, because he was telling Boruto categorically, if you go, you will die, and it's just that simple. So I also don't entirely understand why Kashin Koji couldn't have foreseen Boruto going and telling Kawaki about this plan. Again, I understand theoretically why appointing another point of singularity means that the timeline will change, which Kashin Koji stated is a big reason why they need to keep the number of people who know about the future to a minimum, because if they tell too many people, there will be too many possible futures, which will make 10 directions obsolete. But why could Kashin Koji not see Boruto going and telling Kawaki? I just don't understand why this bypasses 10 directions. directions. The only feasible option I can see here is because Boruto has been given the name the boy who can alter fate itself, where he was able to, for example, alter his own fate of being taken over by Momoshiki, where his resolve to solve the situation exceeded the dread of losing everything he ever loved. That's an example of where the future sight ability failed to work on Boruto because he himself is able to alter fate. Which, can I just add, according to Ikemoto in a recent interview, the visions Momoshiki saw differs from that of 10 Directions. Regardless, Boruto was able to change fate in that instance, so theoretically, he should also be able to exceed 10 Directions and go beyond what is observable using that ability, purely by changing the fate of the world. But I just don't think that's a foolproof way of explaining the situation. Again, let me know what you think on this situation. Do you think it's just Boruto being able to alter fate, which means the Kashin Koji couldn't see this? Or maybe do you think that 10 Directions just doesn't work in the same way that we thought it did? Anyways, it's clear that Kashin Koji made Boruto aware that Kawaki has limiters placed on him by Amado. But perhaps the reason that Boruto worded that interaction in the way he did, saying that you will figure this out yourself at some point, but I don't know whether telling you sooner will be advantageous, is because the only piece of information that Koji told Boruto is Kawaki would figure it out on his own. And Koji never mentioned anything about going and telling Kawaki early, which is why Boruto seemed uncertain as to whether this would be advantageous, because he hadn't been told by Koji that this would actually work. But Boruto instead decided to make Kawaki a point of singularity in that moment by giving him knowledge of the future, which obviously caused 10 Directions to miss his interaction, and most likely why Koji specifically stated that there hadn't been an update in 6 days, because Boruto and Kawaki's interaction must have happened within those 6 days, hence why Koji has never seen this as a possibility of unfolding. Regardless, Boruto clearly devised his own plan with Kawaki, using the knowledge of what Kashin Koji allowed him to know about how the mission would go down, since Boruto knew that they would likely obtain both Thorn Souls, or at least one of them, and hence he also knew that he needed to get onto the battlefield to alert one of them to go and meet up with Delta, which means that he had always planned to actually show up to this battle, and he was just waiting for the perfect time to do so from what Ada was telling him. And he also said later in the chapter that Kawaki was late, implying it was always part of these two's plan to fight Jura together. Final point before we get back to the chapter, I promise, is the fact that Boruto is blatantly going behind Kashin Koji's back and acting on his own, showing not only does he not necessarily agree or trust in these visions that Kashin Koji is seeing, but he also doesn't respect Kashin Koji enough, like he does with Sasuke, as to where he literally followed Sasuke's words and actions to a T, but he doesn't do anywhere near the same with Kashin Koji. It's just something that we need to consider and bear in mind, especially as this arc nears its end, as a potential conflict between Boruto and Kashin Koji is definitely brewing here, and the seeds have now been planted throughout the last 5 or 6 chapters for that to unfold. But finally, getting back to the chapter, Mitsky wonders if Boruto is coming to meet with them by teleporting to one of his markers, and then he will then assist them with getting the Thorn Souls back. However, instead Delta appears behind them, saying she's glad that they all turned out to be safe. This completely shocks Konohamaru and Mitsky, as I'm sure she is the last person they were expecting to meet here. But Delta being shocked here goes back to the idea that Boruto gave Delta and Kawaki the instructions, uncertain of how the battle will actually turn out, as Delta herself was unsure as to whether they would all be okay. Anyways, we then come back to Kawaki versus Jura, where Jura tries to grab or swipe at Kawaki to get him off his back, but Kawaki instantaneously shrinks himself down and appears behind Jura, where he launches multiple rods that pierce right through him. Jura then, relatively taken aback, starts to build up a Bijou bomb and launches it back at Kawaki. Kawaki dodges this, and the bomb lets off a huge explosion, which wakes up Boruto. Kawaki then appears next to Boruto, poking fun at him for lying on the floor lifelessly. Boruto then asks what took you so long, obviously showing Kawaki was supposed to help Boruto fight Jura a lot sooner according to the plan that they had going. But I think because Boruto had to go to the fight prematurely to save Konohamaru is why Boruto had to fight Jura on his own for so long. Jura is completely stunned by how strong Kawaki has become, and the levels of power on display here are completely different from that of before. Kawaki then tells Boruto to hang in there whilst he begins to activate his karma, saying that if Boruto goes berserk here or loses control, he will not hesitate to kill Boruto on the spot. Boruto says don't worry about it and tells Kawaki to go ahead and use his karma, but he does say this whilst gripping his arm in the same way he did back when Kawaki first caused his karma to manifest, implying Boruto's karma is already beginning to activate at the sight of Kawaki's, which makes this a race against time before Momoshiki appears. Jura then begins to fly straight towards Kawaki as Kawaki tells him to bring it on, which means that we can definitely expect Kawaki versus Jura to come in the next chapter, as Jura has clearly decided that he cannot run at the sight of this newfound power. The side text says the blade that curves open fate swings only once, even if one side breaks, the other side strikes without pause, which is a fan translation, by the way. So if it does slightly differ from what you read on the actual chapter, then you have to understand that I do have to make these videos based on fan translations, so sometimes there will be slight differences. But realistically, it's implying that Boruto has quite literally changed fate itself, which is something which I described earlier, which goes back to why Koji couldn't foresee this moment, and it also implies that Boruto and Kawaki are both one, where if one falls, the other will strike instantaneously. Anyways, before I wrap up the video, I have to go over the obvious here, which is what will actually unfold in the future chapters. I would like to do a whole video discussing this, so I won't go too much into it in this video, as it's already getting pretty long at this point, but if that's something you guys want to see, then let me know in the comments down below. Anyways, I must say, I don't think the feat of Kawaki hitting Jura relatively hard twice means an awful lot in how this fight will actually go down. Don't get me wrong, speed blitzing Jura is definitely impressive, and landing an attack of that magnitude is also very, very impressive, but in fairness, Jura was not expecting this, and also he severely underestimated Kawaki in that moment, because obviously last time he could beat Kawaki and knock him unconscious in a single blow, which is why he charged at Kawaki rather carelessly, as he thought he could do the same thing to Kawaki, but Kawaki knew that Jura was underestimating him and used the opportunity to hit him with those rods. But I do still think that Kawaki does have the upper hand here against Jura, purely because of the damage he sustained against Boruto, which may not seem like a lot, but it definitely affected Jura in some way, since he hasn't had time to go back to the Shinju realm and heal up. But I'm honestly excited in the future chapters to see just how strong is Limitless Kawaki. And I also love the design change to obviously signify that Kawaki has changed in terms of power. But what I'm more excited for is of course Momoshiki. And I'm going to boil it down to one of two things happening here. One is next chapter, the majority of the chapter is Kawaki versus Jura, but at the end we get the reveal that Boruto has completely lost control, and we see Borushiki appear as almost like a cliffhanger for that chapter, which I definitely think is a viable option. Or there's the option of Boruto actually has to fight his own consciousness from going into the hands of Momoshiki, where we see Momoshiki and Boruto talking and a conflict occurs, not necessarily a physical one, but definitely there'll be some mental warfare that ends up happening between these two. Either way, it's obvious that Momoshiki will make some form of appearance after being silent for so long, and I will do a video going into each of these possibilities a little more, but I think I've said enough by this point, and I want to know what you guys think will unfold in the coming chapters, so let me know in the comments down below. Regardless, that is going to be a wrap for this video. If you did enjoy, then be sure to smash the like button, just so this video gets pushed out to more and more people, and it also lets me know that you guys are enjoying the content at the moment. Also, if you want to see more Boruto content like this in the future, then be sure to subscribe, as it helps out the channel massively, and it also lets YouTube know to recommend you more of my content. Anyways, with that all said, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.